gender-based violence and minoritisation. So it's directly relevant. And Khatidja's work over many years has been really seminal, really, in thinking about the impact of domestic abuse, gender equalities in different communities. In particular, I'm going to flag some of her early work around self-harm and minoritisation. Which was really, really important work, was some of the first work, and particularly focusing on health and the ways in which certain communities weren't perhaps their needs weren't being met. So I think it's really, really helpful that we've got her here to talk to us. I'm not going to say much more about Khatidja. I am going to put a link in the chat, which is just a link to a page which has her other publications. So if you did want to look in more detail, you can look that up. But I'm going to let Khatidja introduce herself, and then I'm going to share the slides. So over to you, Khatidja.
Well, thank you so much, Emma, for that really generous introduction. I lead a gender-based violence team at Manchester Met University, and I'm delighted to be here. So thanks very much. I'm not going to say much more about myself because you said so much, Emma, so that's great. So if you could start sharing slides, that would be great. Yeah, just putting it on slideshow, aren't you? Yeah, great. So, yeah, so that's me. You've got my email there. If you need to email me, that's fine. During the talk, if there's something that comes to your mind, just put a question or a comment in the chat. That would be great too. Okay, next slide, please, Emma. So, as Emma said, I have been researching gender-based violence over about 25 years, and I'm using this opportunity really to make some key points based on work I've done around gender-based violence and minoritisation. So I'm particularly focusing on those unequal social relations based on ethnicity and gender, and how this impacts help seeking, but also service responses to minoritised women experiencing gender-based violence. So this slide just lists some of my key funded studies where I was the principal investigator, all in which I had a key role, and from which I'll actually be drawing from all of these, including that early work that Emma mentioned, and hopefully you'll see why. It is old, but I think it's still relevant today. So thank you. Next slide, please. So really, I want to begin by, kind of thinking about and exploring some of the key issues in relation to minoritisation and gender-based violence, because often a particular type of cultural framing is used to understand gender-based violence in minoritised communities. And I want to unpack this a little bit. So, because how we frame a problem is absolutely central, not only to how we research it, but also what recommendations we might put forward to improve policy and practice. Now, if we see gender-based violence as purely cultural in minoritized communities, but as a manifestation of an individual act of transgression in white British communities, this does a particular sort of work. It constructs minoritized communities as backward, as more violent, and less engaged with women's rights, while at the same time ignoring the sexism and misogyny that's inherent within white British society. So that's hugely problematic if we're constructing white British perpetrators as just bad apples, rather than considering the cultural and the structural forces at play which feed and maintain gender-based violence. So at a policy and practice level, if we consider the World Health Organization's guidelines for combating gender-based violence globally, what we see is that one of their key recommendations is to shift the culture, changing social norms and shifting the culture. So this indicates that culture is central to gender-based violence, regardless of which community we're looking at. So we can't just disregard this guidance and just conflate culture with minoritized communities. We need to see it much more broadly, really. And I think this is a particular problem about how we see gender-based violence in minoritized communities. It's pretty harmful because at the very least, what it does is that it runs the risk of culture blaming alongside the culturalization of gender-based violence. So we know that one of the key reasons why victims of domestic abuse and other forms of gender-based violence don't get adequate services or justice for the crimes committed against them is to do with victim blaming. So in culture blaming, this slides over to whole cultures. And what that can do is, apart from the racism inherent in that, what it can do is also erase individual agency and make it much, much harder for services to actually hear, listen, and attend to minoritized victims if everything is just seen as, part of their culture. And secondly, if gender-based violence is framed as cultural in minoritized communities and only cultural, we are also in danger of overlooking how social relations based on age, disability, sexuality intersect with culture. So that's hugely problematic because what it does is that it privileges culture above all else. So it doesn't readily engage with the wider structural and systemic injustices. So, of course, culture in all communities is central to perpetration and maintenance of male violence. And that's the key point on this little, maybe slightly academic way of approaching the topic. But if we go to the next slide, please, Emma. So these two quotes are based on our domestic homicide study, HOLT. I wanted to highlight how in the DHRs we often see an uncritical acceptance of cultural norms. So these two quotes are actually quite different from one another. One kind of fits into, if you like, the culture blaming that I discussed earlier in relation. So this is in relation to Iran and Kurdish culture, saying it's male dominated, women living by the rules of men and husbands. It's domestic abuse seldom reported. Police in Iran offer very little assistance. And then the issue of shame upon the family. Okay, well, elements of that may well be true, but I just want to point out that this woman was actually living in Britain. She had approached services for help. So how this kind of helps to kind of, because what that does is very firmly locate domestic abuse within the cultural realm and makes it impossible for people to think about how they might be able to intervene. She had approached services for help. The police hadn't done very much and now seem to be projecting that failure onto a different country. And also what's important is that within the DHRs, what we found was that where culture, race, etc. was discussed, this narrative of domestic abuse seen as part of culture was in not just in the Iranian Kurdish culture, but in South Asian culture, in relation to Black African victims and also African Caribbean, and in fact, everybody who wasn't white British. So you can see how I'm quite bothered about the culturalization of violence, because this is not helping us. On the other hand, the second quote is really very helpful, because what it's starting to do, it's starting to say to people in services, can you please test those assumptions that you have about culture? So even if somebody from a minoritized community says, well, it's, you know, it's inherent within our community, etc., we need to challenge that. You need to say, is this just a personal assumption? What evidence is there for this assertion? And so on. So it's really important that we do that, and we equip practitioners to actually be able to challenge this abuse. Okay, next slide, please, Emma. So what I wanted to do is to combat this kind of way of thinking of normalization of domestic abuse within particular cultures. I want to offer you 3 conceptual resources to combat this sort of thinking. So firstly, the concept of minoritization, which we actually developed and introduced in 2002 on our study on domestic violence and minoritization. Basically, we were looking for a concept that would embrace women of color as well as white minorities. So in that study, it related to Jewish and Irish women. So minoritization is helpful because we wanted a term that made it clear that the focus should be on the socio-cultural process which position certain groups as minorities, and to make it clear that this is a dynamic process. And so moving away from the idea that cultures are static. And this emphasis on sociocultural processes also allows more readily for intersectionality, as it's already engaging with social relations. So minoritization is now widely used, and not just in relation to ethnicity, but to other marginalized groups. So I'm glad that a concept we introduced way back in 2002 has currency today. Okay, next slide, please, Emma. Secondly, I wanted to talk about the concept that we introduced of race anxiety. So this is from that 2001 study that Emma mentioned earlier. And it refers to the discomfort experienced by practitioners when they're working with race, or when they're working with somebody who's culturally different to themselves. And their fear that when they're working with somebody who's culturally different, they might say something wrong or do something wrong, and therefore be labeled racist or culturally insensitive. And this was also found in 2017 on our forced marriage study. So this is a legal practitioner saying, when a practitioner is dealing with someone from a different community and culture, they're not going to want to be non-PC or say anything that's taboo. They're going to want to be sensitive or be respectful to cultural sensitivity. A lot of them are scared of offending people or being culturally insensitive. So I don't know whether you can, or in your work, you've seen this dynamic occurring. But it's closely linked to the third concept. So next slide, please, Emma, which relates to cultural privacy. So as somebody said to me, those cultures over there look after their own and they don't want us to interfere. When we think about what this means, the race anxiety and the cultural privacy taken together, what it means is that professionals are essentially willing to overlook abuse because they are too afraid of being labeled racist or culturally insensitive. And in turn, we need to equip professionals to work sensitively in a way which also challenges abuse. You know, so I think it's not just a case of we need to be respectful of those cultures, and especially if we've already got a kind of framing that normalizes domestic violence. Even if that is the case, we really need to challenge that. So I think what's really important in the analysis of quality, that's right, sorry, Emma, you read my mind already for the next slide. Yeah. What's really important in the analysis of qualitative data in relation to gender-based violence and minoritisation is understanding the wider context and how inequalities impact both the experience of domestic abuse and also professional responses. So, austerity. We know that we've been living with austerity for the last 14, 15 years. And what this has resulted in is a reduction in gender-based violence and domestic abuse specialist services, particularly in the buy and for sector. But this has also had a knock-on impact on other services that women often need, such as mental health services and substance use services. So there have been widespread cuts all around. I think what's also really important is to consider is the increasing gender-based in gender-neutral discourses regarding domestic abuse, and I think that's quite dangerous in some way, because domestic abuse has always been and remains very gendered. So it is really about male violence against women. Now, this is not to say that there are no male victims of domestic abuse. There are, but their victimhood, if you like, is quite different to women's victimhood. They need different types of services, and those should be provided, but alongside women's services. It's not either or, it needs to be both. But the gender neutral discourse, if I can just give you a small example. So, for example, if police are called out to a domestic abuse incident, and it's really important for the police to identify who the key perpetrator is in the relationship, and often this is the male partner, who will say to the police, "Oh well, but she hit me as well," or she hit me. And the gender neutral discourse does not help, because then they're seen as equivalent in the relationship. So the whole context of the relationship, the pattern of the abuse, is missed by the gender neutral framing. The strong anti-immigrant sentiment, not just sentiment, but also its application in policy, is hugely problematic for minoritized women who are seeking help. It's been growing, I would say, over the last 15 to 20 years, and it probably reached a very strong point during the Brexit debate and going forwards as well. And I'll talk about why that's particularly important in relation to minoritized women in a minute. I also want to draw attention to the concept of everyday bordering. This is a concept that Ewell Davis talks about. Everyday bordering refers to the fact that you can't really do anything in this country anymore without proving your immigration status. So whether you're opening a bank account, whether you're trying to rent a property, whether you're trying to get a job, all kinds of things. And Ewell Davis has called this everyday bordering, because people in ordinary jobs now are expected to be quasi-immigration officials. Not at all helpful. But, I'll show you why that matters in a minute. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was the securitization and surveillance, particularly of Muslim communities. And this has been an issue after 9/11 in particular, with interventions such as Prevent and so on. But it's not just Muslim communities. That kind of wariness, hostility has kind of slipped onto not only anybody who may be a Muslim, but other groups, such as, there's no distinction anymore in public discourse between settled migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, etc. And everybody's now in the same box. So I just wanted to draw attention to the wider context, because when you're doing your analysis, you do need to really be mindful of this. And help seeking for minoritized women is heavily influenced by these wider social relations, and in particular, the anti-immigrant climate. So next slide, please. So what this slide, let's just look at what this survivor of forced marriage said. So because that majority community over there doesn't know me, doesn't want me, doesn't trust me, and so particularly if you're from a Muslim background, it's like your choices have suddenly over the last couple of years been diminished as a Muslim woman, diminished over time, diminished with the politics. And so the community feels like it's under siege, and women are part of that community. And therefore they feel as though they are under siege, and therefore they're not going to go and take the risk and have that trusting relationship with the mainstream. So you can see immediately how for this participant, the wider context really impacts on decision making about whether to approach a support agency. Really important. In our 2002 study, we also found that in relation to Irish women who said that at the time of the Troubles, they didn't feel they could approach agencies for help because their whole communities were demonized. So that's why it's important to think of the wider context. Next slide, please, Emma. So, you know, if a woman does decide, a minoritized woman does decide to go and seek help, and if she doesn't speak English, she is going to need interpreting services. Now, this is not rocket science. We've known about it forever. But in the whole study, what we found was that professional interpreters were used in at all, and a whole range of people were used as interpreters, friends, relatives, children's in-laws, and sometimes even the perpetrator to interpret for victims. And this was by the police, by housing and medical professionals. So if the victim survivor would like a friend or a relative who's supportive to her to interpret, that's one thing. But on the whole, we would definitely recommend a professionally trained interpreter, but not just any old professionally trained interpreter, but somebody who's also aware of gender-based violence and domestic abuse. In this particular DHR, you can see a horrible situation where the victim was minoritized, and she was required to give detailed explanations of a serious sexual assault to a male GP and a male police officer, and was then examined by a male forensic medical examiner without the assistance of an interpreter. There was no one present to explain what was happening or the consequences of the examination. It is perhaps not surprising that this woman chose not to support further police investigation or seek help later. I mean, it is horrific because even if the woman did speak English, you would have wanted all those people to be female, preferably, to be able to explain what had happened. But to not actually know what's happening is, it is really not surprising that she didn't want to go any further with that. So I think we have to think again about how is it as services that we're responding to minoritized victims, and what is it that we could do better. So next slide, please, Emma. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about risk assessment. So again, in the context of the whole study, we looked at risk assessment ratings in white British dyads, if you like, and compared to minoritized dyads. And what we found is that agencies were actually more aware of domestic abuse within the victim-perpetrator relationship in minoritized, in minoritized dyads. But if you look at the second circle, they were less likely to be given a risk rating of high. Now, why is this? Let's go to the next slide, Emma, which is on the same theme. So in another study, which was our domestic abuse safeguarding during COVID study, we were looking at ethnicity and police data. And what we found is that Black and minoritized victims seem to have had less accurate domestic abuse risk assessments than white victims. And there was a significant effect of victim ethnicity on the number of dash risk factors ticked. Okay, as you will know, the number of ticks is important because people count up the ticks and then assign a risk rating. There should be a professional judgment as well, but in terms of the risk factors, that is worrying if Black and minoritized victims have less of those risk factors ticked. And we can ask two things. We can ask, are the dash, and I know it's DARA now in policing, but are those forms fit for purpose? Or is there something else happening? Are the officers or the professionals who are completing them not understanding issues around gender-based violence and minoritisation? And also, Black and minoritized victims had significantly less charges and significantly more cases with the outcome where the victim withdrew support compared to white victims. So now we are building an evidence base based on police data about the differential responses. So we've got that far. We have some conceptual understanding of why this might be happening, but I think we definitely need more research to understand what's happening. So we do really need to think about, and is this just happening in policing, or is it happening in health and social care and so on? So it's really opening a bit of a can of worms, I think, here, but we need to open it. Thank you, Emma. Next slide. So I'm going to go back to that 2001 study around South Asian women and attempted suicide and self-harm. I want to talk about a particular participant who I still remember very clearly all these years on. She was a Pakistani woman who was on a spousal visa. It wasn't a forced marriage. She had agreed to and wanted to get married. But when she arrived here, she experienced domestic abuse and domestic servitude. She was living with her in-laws, and they expected her to do all the cooking, cleaning, and all domestic chores. She wasn't allowed to go to the GP on her own, and she attempted to take her life because of the domestic abuse. She felt really trapped. There was no way out for her as she saw it. And an important factor in that was that she had no recourse to public funds. At the time of the interview, she had left the abusive relationship, and that was only possible because her UK-based brother housed and supported her. I just want to talk a little bit about what the policy assumption is of no recourse to public funds, or what it was way back in 2001. So I'll come back to that in a minute. If we can just go to the next slide, please, Emma. So what this survivor said was the 1 year rule, because at that time it was the 1 year rule, causes a lot of problems. The law has given all the power to the man. They can control women for a year. The law has given the man the power to treat me as he wants. I have no protection under the law. It has given the man the right to use me as he wants. It's all in his hands. I've got no rights. So the 1 year rule, or the policy assumption that I wanted to mention, is that at that time, there was an assumption that everybody who was coming into the UK on a spousal visa wasn't coming because it was a genuine marriage. They were coming purely because they wanted to settle here. So there was a whole discourse of sham policy. And even before then, and this is horrible to even think about, before the 1 year rule, there was also virginity testing to see if South Asian women in particular were virgins at the point of marriage. It's just hard, because if they weren't, then obviously the marriage wasn't genuine, because you had to be a virgin to be married if you're South Asian. So the kind of discourse is really very unhelpful about the sham marriage. So if we can go on, you'll be wondering, why am I talking about things from 2001? So next slide, please, Emma. In our domestic abuse safeguarding study in 2022, this is still an issue, and what we found were 3 key themes relating to minoritisation. So the first is still about the very harsh immigration rules and destitution and food poverty. So safeguarding lead saying she's way under what she'd be getting if she was on the most basic of welfare benefits. She's had 3 weeks without any food for her children during the day, 2 children, and she's surviving on nothing. Once you're under the radar, you're really under the radar. We also have evidence of unhelpful service responses. So in this case, a survivor who's approached an agency for help, she said, I think she thought I was just lying because of what she said to me. She thought I was part of those Londoner people who normally come with false stories to fraud the system. So apparently she at some point thought I was playing tricks on them, you know. So here's a woman who, despite all that wider context we're talking about, takes the step to approach somebody for help and gets the distinct impression that that person really doesn't believe her. So if you just think what that's like for a victim of domestic abuse to actually not be believed on the grounds of their immigration status, I don't think I need to say much more. And the third theme was about the way in which perpetrators manipulate their partner's immigration status. So by scaring them, by saying you'd be deported, and a whole range of other things. So those are just 3 themes, and you'll see from 2021 to 2022, we're still grappling with some of the same issues. Next slide, please, Emma. So that probationary period, which was 1 year, is now extended to 5 years. So women finding it even more difficult to escape those relationships where they have no recourse. There are things in place, so the migrant victims domestic violence concession, but that's only available for a really short period whilst applying for indefinite leave to remain. And all these initiatives are quite piecemeal. Really what we need is for no recourse to be abolished. I think that's what we need. But Black women's organisations, Safety for Sisters, Southall Black Sisters, have been very proactive, campaigning about this over a number of years. But unfortunately, the Domestic Abuse Act in 2021 didn't rectify this situation. And I also want to mention the UK's delay in ratifying the Istanbul Convention. As you know, the Istanbul Convention is the European-wide treaty for protecting victims of domestic abuse, for preventing domestic abuse and prosecuting perpetrators. The reason they delayed in ratification is because they didn't want to sign up to the provision of supporting minoritised women, if they didn't have the right immigration status. So it's centrally important in minoritisation, and you can see how the wider context directly impacts on people's experiences. Next slide, please, Emma. So I just wanted to highlight that services that are delivered by a GP, treatment for certain contagious diseases and emergency department hospital are free of charge to everyone, regardless of their immigration status. So what we found in our DASC study is that if somebody had no recourse, there was an automatic assumption, an erroneous assumption, that they weren't entitled to anything. So it's really important that people are aware of what entitlements people are, can get. And from the BMA, There is no contractual duty to seek evidence of identity, immigration status, or proof of address. Practices should not refuse registration on the grounds that a patient is unable to produce such evidence. Practice staff do not have to make any assessment of immigration status or eligibility for NHS care. They are not expected to act as immigration officials. So you can see how the concept of everyday bordering has filtered into GP practices when it doesn't need to. Okay, next slide, please. So I think it's been pretty depressing up to now, and I thought it'd be quite nice to kind of, as we draw to a close, to talk about some positive support. So again, in our domestic abuse safeguarding during COVID study, here are two survivors talking about their experiences with healthcare professionals. So the first survivor saying she had NHS support because she was in a high-risk pregnancy and that she was looked after very, very closely by everybody involved. She didn't explain the domestic abuse that was happening, but she knew that they had suspicions because of the particular sort of health issues she was presenting with. So a really good example of how people in general practice and in other sectors, hospital-based, etc., can look behind the presenting health issue for indications of domestic abuse. And way back in 2017, as it was then, the Department of Health have produced some really good guidelines about the types of things people might present with. For example, pelvic pain, unexplained pelvic pain might be, there might be something else behind that particular domestic abuse. And in the second quote, my midwife realized that this was not good, so she kept asking, when are you coming out? Do you know this is coercive control, a form of abuse? And she'd taken a leaflet with her to show the survivor about the types of abuse. And I think what's important here, often professionals just hand a leaflet over without having the discussion with the victim survivor about different types of abuse, so that the victim survivor can begin to identify for themselves that what they're experiencing is actually abusive. So I think that was really positive step to take. I think the other positive things people can do is to approach minoritized victims with empathy, to understand, particularly where people have no recourse to public funds, about what their entitlements are, so not to fall into the trap of assuming non-entitlement, to challenge all those things I've talked about before, particularly the culturalization of violence. So there are things you can do. I know you can't change people, we can't change the wider social context, but we can understand and work to understand how these impact on minoritized women. And the next slide, please. So after HALT, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner had commissioned us to do a study which looks specifically at DHR recommendations for health, for adult social care, for children's social care, and the criminal justice system. And these were some of our recommendations for health. So this is not just about primary care, I know, but there are certain things that are, that are kind of cross whichever sector of the health ecosystem you're working in. So you'll have seen improving domestic abuse risk assessment. This applies across the board, regardless of ethnicity, but particularly in relation to minoritized women, because even that does need further, further work. It does, and we do need to improve the way we do that. Improving responses to carers. So there is an issue around age as well. We tend to think of domestic abuse. It is more prevalent in younger age groups, but in terms of domestic homicide, there's a fairly kind of flat rate in our study between women aged 16 to 55, and then it tailors off a bit for intimate partner. But if you factor in adult family homicide, the over 66 also feature. So understanding the care context. What we've done so far is that we've identified mental health, substance use as kind of contextual features for domestic abuse and domestic homicide, but we've paid much less attention to care contexts, and I think we need to change that. So those are the recommendations. Next slide, please. We do have resources that you may want to look at. We have papers. Most of these are open access, so you can access them through the HOLT website. Next page, please. That is the HOLT website, so please do have a look at it if you haven't already. There's lots of useful information on there. And then next. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for listening. Look forward to answering any questions or comments you have.
Thank you, Khatidja. That's really, really interesting. I've got loads of questions, but I'm not going to take advantage of my chairing privilege, and I'm going to open it up. Can I ask if anybody does want to ask a question, if you could put your hand up, and then I can come to you. Okay. Oh, Lee, go on.
Yeah, I've talked away to you because it was on mute. I first of all thought it was really interesting. Thank you. I know that when you showed us that research, there was obviously the part that's in the past, but I have had even this week within Septum from a practice that's actually Irish trained. The patient told her GP she was in a domestic abuse relationship. She's from an ethnic minority. And he said to her, oh, well, he's always lovely and polite when he comes to see me. And this is like, I'm not talking years ago, this is like literally last week. And that was from a practice that I've trained. So it's hard to change their opinions on things if they're not willing to be open. And you just have to keep trying. And I think I'd heard this story from one of the other AEs who told me her patient was Black Caribbean. And the patient's GP said to her, oh, isn't that just part of your culture anyway? So it's still happening now, not just a million years ago. But it was
thank you for raising that. And yes, I do think these concepts are just as relevant today. And some of them were, in our study from 2022, so 2022. And the DHRs obviously have only been in existence since 2011. You can see a continuity, but it's great. Well, not great. It's not great to hear what you just said, but it does.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we have to keep trying. And I think that's the only thing, we can do. We've been saying some of the same things for many years, but I think they still need to be said.
Yeah.
Because it's not changed.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Anybody else want to come in? I can't remember how easy it is to put your hand up on Zoom. So if you do just want to unmute and ask a question, that's fine. Okay, if you're not, I'm going to jump in. So Khatidja, I was really interested in what you were saying about race anxiety. And I wondered whether or not, given the example we've just had from Lee, we know there was still lots and lots of issues, but I wonder if that particular issue around race anxiety, whether there's been any changes in relation to that since kind of Black Lives Matters, that kind of maybe whether there has been some cultural shifts around those assumptions around that.
Yeah, I don't know is the honest answer, because we haven't really been looking, I suppose, specifically at this. But I think it is useful because, you could argue not just Black Lives Matter, but the backlash to Black Lives Matter has kind of freed up people. That strong anti-immigrant hostility, etc., has freed up people to say things around race, ethnicity, immigration that would never have been voiced 20 years ago. So I don't know whether race anxiety is a is still a valid concept, but actually for individual practitioners, if they feel, oh, you know, oh, should I be saying this or should I be doing this? I don't want to put a step, you know, put a step wrong. It's just as well to be aware of it, that that is what might be, you know, occurring and taking place. I don't know what your experience is, people, you know, in the audience, whether you feel this is still relevant or whether you think people have moved away from that. Don't know if anybody wants to comment.
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you. Yes, I would say it still is very relevant, and I think we're still very much in the early stages of moving away from when we're talking about the Black and Caribbean community, moving away from this idea that violence is normal and women are strong Black women. So, you know, it just adds more barriers to getting support. And then what happens is that without the support, we are seeing an increase in the African Caribbean community and mental health problems.
Yeah.
So I still think there's work that needs to be done there. I appreciate the work that you've done, and this session has been enlightening. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for commenting. And yes, I mean, you're absolutely right that there are stereotypes in place. So strong Black women, you know, so what that does is it makes services think, oh, well, we don't really need to intervene because this woman is strong. That's part of her culture. You know, missing fathers, strong women, they carry everything on their shoulders. But nobody stops to think, okay, in some ways, strong Black woman is a positive stereotype, but nobody stops to think what the other effect of that is. If you're always strong, when is your vulnerability recognized? Because nobody is strong all the time. And then in contrast, if you think about the stereotype associated with South Asian women, they're just passive. They can't do anything and they're completely culture bound. So you can see how, you know, these stereotypes really do work against women being heard, being listened to, and being offered appropriate services. So thank you for raising that.
Yeah, thank you.
Helen, would you like to come in?
Hello, sorry. I'm not sure if it was mentioned or if I briefly missed it, so I had to take one call, but I was quite interested with the when the sort of the risk assessments, when you were saying that minoritized communities were scoring like lower risk. Was that from a selection of DHRs that those risks had, or is that sort of a general sample? I wasn't quite sure where that sample of data.
That finding was replicated in another study as well. So the DHR study, we had 302 DHRs altogether.
Yeah.
And so that was all the DHRs that there were at the time of the study that we could access, because as you know, they're on kind of multiple, before the repository, they were on multiple community safety partnership sites. So that was everything that we could gather. I think it's quite representative in terms of the demographics and so on, because we've kind of checked with the homicide index and stuff like that. So we're talking about 300, out of which 100 were minoritized. Or so that's interesting in itself. But then in another study, which is the domestic abuse safeguarding during COVID, where we looked at police force data of 2 police forces to look at the differences between white British and minoritized victims. They had, so there was a significant effect of victim ethnicity on the number of dash risk factors ticked.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's just interesting to sort of feed that back to the teams.
Yeah.
We
do need to do more research, but yeah, I think there is an issue there.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else got a comment or a question for Khatidja whilst we've got her here? Okay, well, you think I've got a final question for you, Khatidja, sorry. And this is, again, it's a how long is a piece of string kind of question, but obviously one of the things that the group, that the advocate educators and the clinical leads are doing is trying to flag with clinicians who are dealing with patients the need to acknowledge the additional barriers that different communities might face, but at the same time not perpetuating those stereotypes that people have, but that by focusing on that, focusing on some of those barriers, it can perpetuate that idea that it's culturally bound, it's acceptable or accepted, and that it's somehow more prevalent perhaps in certain communities than others, but we're still wanting to identify the barriers. How do we go about doing that so that we're not perpetuating those myths and stereotypes, but also trying to really get clinicians to understand what the additional barriers are faced by different communities?
I mean, I do think that one of the main barriers is this culturalization of violence, you know. So if we can then do what I always find helpful is to say, okay, so this is the discourse. Let's look at, you know, are we then saying that domestic abuse in white communities is not a cultural issue? And you can take, for example, so forced marriage, often seen as a cultural issue. What about date rape? That's never seen as a cultural issue, is it? You know, so what you do is kind of juxtapose what's happening in the white British communities and question and interrogate. Why is one thing seen as cultural but not another? I think, you know, the barriers, things like no recourse to public funds, I think it can be talked about. It's not about replicating stereotypes. What it is doing is laying bare the structural forces that shape those experiences and how practitioners, professionals need to be wary of that and not imbuing those kind of, you know, hostile responses, but being kind of empathic and responding to the woman in front of them. But so the Domestic Abuse Commission has released a report, didn't they? Was it last year, around immigration, for example, and suggested that there shouldn't be contact between agencies and the Home Office or the border agency, because that's what the other thing that women are afraid of is that if they reach out. So it's things like that that you can introduce. You know, the government of the day didn't accept that, but. So that's it. I think the understanding that there are cultural dimensions to all forms of abuse in whichever community is really helpful. And, you know, not being afraid to name abuse when you see it. But that needs to be done in it. And, you know, sometimes I have heard of cases where particularly the family, minoritized families will say, yeah, but that's just part of our culture. And then that stuns the, you know, the professional, but they need to challenge that.
Yep.
You know, and the way to do that is, yeah, sorry, yeah.
No, I was just going to add there, when we're talking about FGM, for example, we do sometimes refer to, you know, the idea of the husband stitch is not massively dissimilar in terms of its origins and its purpose. So we do try, I think, when we're delivering training to the AEs, but also when they're out there doing that, to give some of those examples. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
No, go.
I was just going to say, obviously, the buy and force sector are very important as well, aren't they? Because they are able to explicate the issues really well, have experience of this, and you know, would not necessarily condone FGM or forced marriage or any of these other issues. So it's important that their voice is also part of the mix, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. We're coming up to the hour mark, so I know everybody's got other busy meetings and clients to see and things. Thank you, Khatidja. We really, really appreciate you coming to talk to us today. We will make the recording available to those members of the network who weren't able to attend today, so that they can hear your presentation, because I think it's really helpful. Yeah, and yeah, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.